We affirm resolved, the United States federal government should impose price controls on the pharmaceutical industry. Our first contention is ending corrupt marketing. Swanson of the Washington Post 15 explains that pharmaceutical companies spend approximately $24 billion annually marketing to physicians who prescribe medications, twice as much as they spend on research and development. Problematically, The Economist 17 reports that pharmaceutical companies market their drugs to doctors by providing kickbacks and hiding the risk of the drug, among other means of coercion, in order to increase the frequency in which they prescribe their drug. Ornstein of UPenn 16 calculates that every $5,000 spent on marketing to a particular physician by a pharmaceutical company increases the prescribing rate of that drug by 10%, which is why Franklin of the Guardian 11 argues that pharmaceutical companies' marketing campaigns are a major contributor to America's overprescribing problem. However, price controls restrict marketing campaigns, as said of the U.S. Library of Medicine 13 finds that in a meta-analysis of 19 developed countries from 1992 to 2004, that price controls reduced pharmaceutical revenues by 23%. And due to the sheer size of marketing budgets, Data Reuters 10 finds that during financial uncertainty, marketing expenses are likely to be slashed the most heavily by pharmaceutical companies, which is critical as corrupt marketing is ultimately caused the opioid crisis. As Novak of CNBC reports that the marketing tactics of pharmaceutical industries are to blame for the crisis with misleading data and an unethical push for doctors to prescribe opioids in huge numbers. As a result, the National Institute on Drug Abuse 18 found that 115 Americans die every single day from opioid overdoses. Our second contention is reducing drug costs. A 2018 report from the U.S. Committee on Homeland Security indicates that drug prices increased at 10 times the rate of inflation from 2012 to 2017. As a result, Berman of Yale 17 finds that more than 1 in 4 Americans currently taking medications report difficulty in affording them. Price controls solve this in 2 key ways, and the first is through capping cost. Hassett of the International Trade Administration 04 explains that the net benefit of price controls is to provide patients with drugs at much lower prices than in an unregulated market. Hassett furthers, prices for 60 drugs launched between 1995 and 2000 in countries with price controls were 40% lower than prices within the U.S. Second is by weakening pharmaceutical monopolies. Fox of Harvard 17 explains that drug monopolies currently prevent competition through pay-for-delay agreements, in which a name-brand drug company pays generic companies to not launch a version of a drug, raising drug costs by $3.5 billion a year. However, price controls combat monopolies, as Gordon of the University of Oslo 05 explains, that price controls lower barriers of entry for generic drugs and reduce the market power of monopolies, resulting in an increase in the market shares of generic drugs, which ultimately drives down drug prices, as Easton of Stat News 18 estimates that unrestricted growth on the generic drug market has the ability to reduce drug prices by 50% by 2032. Lowering prices leads to 2 key impacts, and the first is increasing access to drugs. According to Nguyen of Community Catalyst 18, 1 in 4 Americans taking prescription drugs reported skipping doses or cutting pills in half due to the cost, which is why Boyle of the NICDS 17 estimates that medication non-adherence causes nearly 125,000 preventable deaths and 10% of hospitalizations every year. Second is ensuring public medical coverage. Bennett of the World Health Organization's 97 explains that through various forms of public health care programs, the U.S. government pays for more than 40% of prescription drug costs. In fact, Lupkin reports that rising drug costs increases Medicaid spending by approximately $3.2 billion annually. Unfortunately, cuts to public health care are a problem, as Wagnerman of George Washington University's 17 impacts that Medicaid reduced poverty by 17%.
Okay, we'll take a look at the price. All right, is everybody ready?
we negate, and our sole contention is a broken system. McGreal of the Guardian 17 finds that over the last decade, the pharmaceutical industry has poured nearly $2.5 billion into lobbying, with over 90% of Congress members accepting campaign contributions. Hancock from the New York Times 17 confirms that over 24 bills aimed at curbing drug costs have been introduced over the last 8 years, many with bipartisan support, yet all have fallen short due to these industries' cash. Historically, the New York Times notes that heavy lobbying by the drug industry made the Clinton administration back away from the potential implementation of pharmaceutical price controls. This outside political influence means that price controls are doomed to fail. Big corporations with a vested interest in high prices will lobby the government to create gaping loopholes that render the bill useless. For example, Cox of CNBC furthers that after sweeping financial regulations were passed in 2006, the nation's biggest financial institutions lobby for loopholes to get around them, setting the path for more profitability in the future. With expensive legal teams and large pools of cash at their disposal, large multinational drug businesses will be unlikely to change their behavior, shifting the brunt of the financial burden almost exclusively onto small businesses. Yeo of the University of Nottingham 17 confirms that price controls hit small businesses the worst because they don't have the resources or infrastructure to adapt as quickly as big businesses. They also lack the connections needed to voice these concerns to policymakers, whether it be to law firms, business chambers, or politicians. Unfortunately, while big companies have the most concentrated monopoly power and are largely responsible for America's drug pricing crisis, small businesses need high profitability to drive innovation forward. Brinkman of Harvard 02 explains that the risk that small companies take is predicated on the potential for a large reward in the form of high sales, meaning that they're even more dependent on superior returns. As a result, price controls by cutting into returns considerably would make it harder for these firms to attract external investment and financing. This is especially true in the United States, where Gina V. Hill 18 explains that only 1 out of every 12 drugs succeeds, the average drug takes 11 to 14 years to develop, and the cost of bringing one to the market ranges from $1 to $2.6 billion. When profit margins are slashed, companies have less capital on hand to invest in innovation, so they borrow money to take on a greater share of costs, which means that more companies go bankrupt in times of economic instability. This is why Abbott of the University of Connecticut 05 confirms that for every 10% decrease in pharmaceutical prices, R&D investment decreases by 6%, while in the long term, Giddens of the American Action Forum 15 quantifies that each 10% decrease in regulatory costs causes an additional 400 small businesses to shut down in the industry. Empirically, Dean of Emory University 18 finds that after India imposed price controls, local pharmaceutical businesses saw a 15% decrease in market share. Destroying American small businesses would be disastrous, as Lueno of CNBC 18 finds that they represent nearly 2/3 of all drug innovation over the past 5 years. The impact of stifling innovation is reducing global drug deployment. Easton of UChicago 18 argues that America has been the world leader as a source of new drugs, a lead that is widened as other countries are imposing pharmaceutical regulations. The McKinsey Institute in 2017 corroborates that with advancements in large drug therapies and individualized treatments, the pharmaceutical industry is on the next horizon of innovation. Unfortunately, the University of Connecticut found that if price controls had been implemented during the late 1980s, 200 drugs would have never made it to the market, wiping out a generation's worth of potential cures. Crucially, U.S. innovation allows other countries to import our innovations and supply them for less or free to the poor via their own national healthcare programs and NGOs. For example, Cooper of the Library of Economics and Liberty 06 confirms that when Merck created its anti-AIDS drugs, it was able to give it to underdeveloped countries in Africa and Latin America for 1/10 of its original price. Overall, the National Bureau for Economic Research 14 explains that new therapies created by the American Research and Development have accounted for 73% of the increased life expectancies across the developing world in modern history. And since 2000 alone, Beswer of the American Council on Science Health quantifies that new U.S. medical innovations have saved 20 million people worldwide. That's Sweeney Gates.
First question?
Yeah.
Okay. So, on lobbying, are small businesses actually doing well right now in the pharmaceutical industry?
Yes.
How?
We read the Lueno analysis. It says that in the past 5 years, 63% of the drugs have came from small businesses.
Okay.
Can I
So,
ask you a question?
Sure.
Oh wait, you can finish your statement.
Yeah. So if we had price control, right? Wouldn't that allow for small businesses to have less regulation on monopolies, so then they could actually grow?
No, they wouldn't grow more though.
Why?
Because small businesses are predicated on high rates of return, which means that they need high prices to generate high profit. And price control would decrease those prices, and therefore profitability margins are slack.
Don't small businesses thrive on having like cheaper prices but selling a lot of those cheaper goods?
No, they thrive off of having investments to have a sustainable research and development.
Yeah, they get investment off selling a lot of like goods,
No,
right?
investment
Because they
is-
have them for cheaper prices.
No,
like smaller businesses primarily like sell generics, which are sold for a lower price.
No, because they thrive off investment. We both agree this is true. The way they get investment is to show that they're a profitable industry. But if they have to borrow money and they
Wait,
have
if
to
they're
go
profitable,
into debt,
how are they small?
you can be profitable but be a small business.
Right, but they're
Profitability is
smaller.
not
Like the
linked to-
smaller industries are obviously going to have prices at like
No,
a
the
lower
reason
price
why they're
point.
profitable right now is because they can use a lot of money to make drugs, and they can get that with the return of high prices. But if they have low prices, the lots of money that investors put into research and development wouldn't necessarily go back to them because the prices are small, so profitability is also small.
Okay.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So let's talk about your first contention where you talk about like bad marketing techniques.
Yeah.
So doesn't the FDA require that people who use these types of advertisements and marketing be based off of clinical trials?
I mean, I'm not really sure, but all I tell you is that obviously the regulation is
So given the fact that they do have to use it based off clinical trials, if one company were to show a doctor that this drug is ineffective, how does that make a doctor more likely to prescribe that
Wait,
drug?
no. The drugs were already regulated by the FDA. We're saying that after the drugs were already made and after the drugs are put into the market,
Yeah, but they
they're
have
being prescribed
clinical-
more because these doctors are being like lobbied by the pharmaceutical companies.
Okay, so the way a doctor is able to prescribe a drug is to say, oh wait, this drug is actually pretty good. But if the drug is not good, why would they prescribe it?
Okay, because they're getting money. We tell you that for every $5,000 put towards a doctor from a pharmaceutical company, the prescribing rate of that drug increases by
how many
10%.
more
So
opioids
simply,
would there
like,
be? How many less opioids would there be if there wasn't this marketing campaign?
I mean, less. I think
Yeah.
like if we could save like one person from like not overdosing on opioids because they're not being like prescribed when they don't need, like that's a pretty good thing. But we have
Sure.
like 15 seconds, so if I could ask a question,
Yeah.
that'd be great. Okay, so you say that like on innovation, right? Like small businesses are like doing like really well. Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so like if we had price controls, like if like small businesses are already put in like in a bad economic situation, like why would lowering prices for like which is mainly for like bigger businesses, like why would they be the ones being hurt?
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
Yeah, so we say that they're profitable right now. Price controls would make them less profitable.
Okay.
Okay. Once I get my time, we're good. Cool. Okay, sorry, now. Okay. So I'm just going to be responding to their case and then doing some waiting time.
Cool.
All right. When everyone is ready. Okay. So they give you one contention. At the top of this contention, they give you this really blippy thing about politics and lobbying. The biggest problem with this is that they try and paint this idea that a policy with loopholes is worse than no policy at all. However, the opposite is true. Having a policy that regulates drug spending by some degree is better than having no policy at all. But even still, we are the ones that have the only risk of solvency in today's round for the issue of monopolies and lobbying that they talk about. As Vox of Harvard News explains, that monopolies currently maintain their control in the drug market and keep generics out of the markets by pay-to-delay agreements. These agreements are basically when pharmaceutical monopolies pay off smaller generic drug manufacturers not to release new drugs in order to maintain their monopoly power in the market, which is what accounts for $3.5 billion worth of the increase in drug costs every single year. However, we are the only ones that have a risk of solvency for this, as the University of Oslo specifically finds that once you implement price controls, you lower barriers of entry for generic drugs and also limit the power of these monopolies because they don't have as much revenue to invest into things like lobbying and marketing like they tell you are so bad. Which is why in Norway, when they implemented price controls, they saw their generic drug market skyrocket because of the fact that the generic drug companies actually had a chance of competing with monopolies. But then, they go on to talk about this idea of R&D. A lot of problems here. First, Vitaly of Copenhagen University explains that this is really reverse causal. Over the past 20 years, we've seen drug prices increase at 10 times the rate of inflation. However, we've been seeing the number of new drugs that are released through R&D projects decline every single year for the past 20 years. Make them prove to you that drug prices are actually correlated with research and development, because right now, they're not. But secondarily, make them prove to you that the drugs that they're producing are actually effective. As Pryor of the US Senate explains, that 84% of the new drugs produced through research and development right now are what we call Me Too drugs. Basically, they're just drugs that are slight variations of existing drugs that the companies make to line their pockets. That's really important because they have to prove to you in order to access any of their lives' impacts in today's round that they're actually producing the 16% of drugs that actually have an impact on the market and are not just slight variations of existing drugs that are used to line the pockets of CEOs. But then, turn this against them. As Worski of the Washington Post explains, that private investment into research and development is actually really bad in comparison to investment from like public sectors like the National Institute of Health for one main reason. First, because they cut corners and it forces them to avoid the risks associated with the drug and ignore the side effects. This was empirically proven a couple of years ago when Vioxx came out as a new drug for high cholesterol. However, it caused 27,000 additional deaths from heart attacks because there was no, they cut corners and they ignored the risks associated with it because the private sector was the one doing the research and there was no checkbacks. But secondarily, then they go on to talk about this idea that small businesses are not going to be able to invest or they're going to have a lack of investment. They're basically talking about cuts to the budget. The biggest problem with this is that it's literally just not going to happen. As Pryor explains, that the US government gives upwards of $1 billion per year to each company specifically for research and development. That's really important because we actually increase the amount of funding that the government can give out to this in the pro world. We explain that because of the fact that the government spends the government is the one that foots the bill for 40% of all drug costs in the United States. By decreasing drug costs, you save them money, leaving them more money to allocate to other things like research and development. The issue of research and development is non-unique because you can literally just do it with public spending rather than private, which you have more of in our world. But lastly, a couple of weighing mechanisms. First, on a prerequisite. We will always win because affordability outweighs our prerequisite. It doesn't matter how many new drugs you make if nobody can afford them. According to Klessenheim of the American Medical Association, right now the new and innovative drugs that they talk about are only 10% of prescriptions, but 72% of drug costs. Make them prove to you that the new and innovative drugs that they talk about are actually accessible to those in need. But secondarily, on probability. The probability of a new breakthrough drug is too low, even with necessary funding. We are the only ones that guarantee a decrease in drug prices. As Berkerot of Reuters finds that the probability that a drug even passes phase 1 of clinical trials and even makes it to the FDA to be approved is only 10%. They only have a 10% probability of their impacts happening. We have 100%.
We're going to take running break now.
Okay.
That was like 50 seconds. We'll be starting off on our case.
Cool.
Everyone ready? On our case, First, on lobbying, they have a couple responses. First, they tell you that pay delay is being used to maintain monopolies. The problem is, in an app world, they would still be able to do pay to delays. There's nothing about price controls that change that. Then she tells you that there'd be better generic competition. The problem is, generic competition gets worse in their world because they weren't retail in our case. Most generics come from small companies that are trying to be competitive. The problem is, they can't make much money, even if there's price controls, meaning they can't get into the market. That's why the NCBI finds that European countries that implemented price controls had higher generic prices than if they didn't implement them. Then she tells you on innovation, it's actually slowing down the status quo. We tell you the reason why it's like the amount of drug that's being approved is slowing down is because the cost of R&D is getting much, much higher. That comes from Harper of Forbes, which is why you can't have price controls. If the root cause, the root problem in why R&D is slowing down the status quo is cost, you can't put price controls that makes it even harder for them to pay. Moreover, the McKinsey analysis in our case tells you that because of precision medicine and because of advances in technology, we are the next horizon of innovation, meaning it's going to be much better in the future. Then she tells you there's not improvements, it's only Me Too drugs. The problem is it's big businesses that are making the Me Too drugs. We tell you that small businesses are the ones that make super innovative drugs because they need to be new in order to make it on the market. Then she tells you that the private sector is bad and like they're making drugs that are actually really bad. Like that doesn't make any sense. Obviously, we both think that pharmaceuticals are really beneficial. There's literally 4 phases of clinical trials that companies and the government have to do in order to make sure a drug is beneficial. They can make one isolated exception. That doesn't mean saving a million lives won't happen. Then she tells you that government research and development and public sector research and development is much better. 2 problems. First, the Policy Med Institute in 2018 finds that 80 to 98% of all FDA-approved drugs were discovered by the private sector. Second, Second, the IEDM finds that the public sector only does really basic research, whereas the private sector is needed to bring them to market because they spend billions developing it and conducting clinical trials. Then, on their first contention about marketing, there's 2 problems. First, you can turn it against them. These price controls would remove an important safety net in extra profits from drugs, meaning that companies wouldn't have anything to fall back on. When profits are low and they're really risky, companies would definitely cut risky R&D compared to advertising. That's why Swether of Berkeley in 2013 finds that price controls actually encourage manufacturers to shift resources away from research and development and towards marketing existing drugs because investing money in experimental R&D would no longer be cost effective. Second, like Jasper alludes to in Crossfire, false advertising might have been a problem of the past, but the FDA now requires clinically proven advertisements to be medically accurate. It's not going to happen anymore. They're impacted about the opioid crisis, but they have an impact about how marketing led to the opioid crisis, but affirming and implementing price controls won't do anything to stop this. It's already happening. It's non-unique. There's no risk of offense on their side. Then, on their second contention about lowering costs, you can group both warrants because there's a couple of overarching responses. First, as an overview, the thesis of our case is about how price controls won't have an effect on drug prices because of the political influence of the pharmaceutical lobby. Any price regulation that gets passed will be full of loopholes and exemptions that companies can easily exploit to maintain current prices. For example, after Nixon put price controls on the steel industry in the 70s, big steel corporations lobbied to unregulate prices on goods from other countries. In doing so, they could send their materials to a factory on the border of Canada and redirect them back to the United States, getting around the regulations. But small businesses, without the infrastructure to do that, went out of business. Which is why we tell you that price controls aren't going to do anything to increase accessibility. All they're going to do is screw over small firms that drive medical innovation. Then, our case about how price controls hurt small businesses links into their case in 3 ways. A, by making medication more cost-effective. Robinson of Berkeley in 2008 finds pharmaceutical innovation can actually save consumers money in the long term because new drugs are often cheaper to manufacture or use them than the ones that they replace. B, better innovation means overall healthcare costs are cut. When new vaccines or medications are discovered, people who take them don't need to get surgeries or make as many hospital visits, which are way more expensive. In fact, Cornell in 2009 quantifies that an extra $1 spent on pharmaceuticals can save up to $10 on emergency room visits and inpatient hospitalizations. Third, the root cause of high drug prices are pharmaceutical benefit managers, or PBMs, which are the middlemen in drug transactions, purchasing medicines from pharmacies and selling them to consumers at higher prices. We tell you that they do that in either world. In Eubanks of the Pharmacy Times finds the top 3 PBMs manage drug costs for approximately 95% of the US population. That means that affirming would only benefit the remaining 5%. They really don't have much of an impact.
Are you ready for cross?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So since I spoke first, I believe that first question and the judges are ready. Okay. So let's talk about your front line on the Fox analysis. You said that they still have paid delay in an affirmative world.
Yeah.
Why?
Because they can just pay generic companies to delay.
Wait, but how are they going to pay the $3.5 billion that it costs to do this
By
when
cutting
they're
innovation.
losing revenue?
By cutting innovation.
No. If anything, I would argue that they're going to cut from the largest sector first. And
No.
because marketing is such
Well,
a large
how they're
sector,
going to
that's
make their
go-
decisions on base where they cut is based on how risky they are. Because
don't
now
think
they
that's
don't have as
necessarily
much of a profit to fall back on.
So let's talk about historically. So like
Okay.
a couple of years ago, there was a huge wave of like patents that expired. They only last 12 years. So a lot of big drug monopolies started losing money because of that. Where was the first place they cut from?
Well, they didn't actually cut in the 2000s.
No,
What
they
they
cut from
did
marketing.
is they started
That's what they're-
merging and buying
No,
out
no, no.
smaller generic companies.
The
I can
Reuters
read you evidence that
analysis
says
is really
that.
clear when it explains that when they went through these financial hardships, the first place they cut from was marketing because of the sheer size of the budget.
Okay, financial uncertainty is different. And I tell you that in the 2000s,
Wait, I feel like if they're
what
losing
actually
profits,
happened in
financial uncertainty is
what
financial
actually happened in the
uncertainty.
2000s in order to prevent themselves from losing profit is that monopolies started buying out the generic companies so there wouldn't be any more
Through
competition.
paid
Like that's
to
way
delay,
worse.
right? That's basically what paid to delay is.
After price controls were implemented by Medicare.
Wait,
in
no.
response to
Medicaid
that.
is not allowed to negotiate drug prices.
Or just like after the
Like,
government
Medicaid does
implemented
not
some
have price
form,
controls.
I'm not sure exactly what it was. I can show you the evidence that after the government increased the negotiating power of some government agency, that they
It
were
was
able to
probably
lower
the Veterans
prices. Companies
Administration,
started
which
merging.
still pays really high drug prices. But you can ask me a question.
Okay, yeah, sure. So you tell me that like private sector cuts corners. So does that mean that pharmaceutical innovation is actually bad?
No, we just tell you that public research and development is better comparatively
So
than
how do you
private.
guys increase public innovation?
Okay, so we specifically tell you at the bottom of our case that because the government spends, is footing the bill for 40% of all pharmaceutical costs, by decreasing pharmaceutical prices, you free up money for them to invest.
How do you know that they're going to invest in?
Well, I would argue that if you're telling me that research and development is going to be such a big problem, then they're going to address
There's
the
probably
problem.
a lot of other big problems that the government would spend.
Right, but if anything, we're the only ones that have a risk of solving.
Can you give me
something like
one piece of evidence that says that's true?
I mean, I can give you the pieces of evidence that we have in our case that say what the argument is.
Does it say that if like the government gets more money, they're going to spend on public sector R&D?
It says that right now Medicaid is cutting
So
coverage
that's
because they
fine.
can
You have a
afford it.
question?
Yes. So let's talk about let's talk about political influence, right?
Sure.
So companies need to have profits to invest in having political influence, right?
Yeah.
So how exactly are they going to be able to maintain this level of influence as their revenues decline?
By cutting from R&D. And the problem is their influence and their money is not going to decline. When there's a bill for price controls, the companies just lobby with the money they have right now. They put loopholes and exemptions in their drugs, so they bypass it.
So let me
but
ask
small
you this.
businesses
So
don't.
let me ask you this. Is a policy with loopholes better than no policy at
So
all?
we're not saying that there's going to be backlash or it's going to be bad.
No, you're just advocating that, like, you're basically
so
saying,
our
like, price
argument
controls
is,
are-
wait, I just want to explain
Go
this.
ahead.
So our argument is that big companies, because they can lobby, won't be affected, so they can sell high prices. Only small businesses that can't lobby would be the ones that are hurt, and they only contribute to innovation.
Okay. We're gonna run out of time. I think we have a minute 8 left. If I'm correct.
No, not keeping
Okay,
up.
okay. We have 1 second left.
Okay. Hope you use it wisely. What side of the flow is it starting on?
I'm going to go our case, their case, and then some way.
Cool.
Is everybody ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's start off on the first reason to vote for the affirmative today, and that's on marketing. Simply, what we tell you right now is that pharmaceutical companies, they have a lot of money, and they use this money to lobby doctors into prescribing drugs that they don't necessarily need to do. They try and tell you that they're still going to be able to do so, but that's not really a response. And remember what Emma tells you from Reuters, is that in the past, when the patents expired and when other countries had price controls, the first place that they cut from was marketing, because it's the most expensive. When we have price controls in the US, we're going to see a cut from marketing, and we're going to see this cut in overprescribing. But now, let's go into our second contention when we talk about reducing drug costs, right? They talk about R&D solving that. But the only problem here is that the R&D problem, that's a maybe. If we maybe have research and development, we maybe will have medicines that may be able to reduce drug costs. But just fundamentally, when we have price controls, that's a reduce in drug costs, that's an increase in access. You can vote for us off there. That's really important because Boylan tells us that non-adherence causes 125,000 deaths every single year. When we increase access, we decrease the amount of lives that are lost. You can vote for us up there. But now let's go on to their case when they talk about this fundamental system, right? And first on lobbying. Remember what Emma tells you from Harvard, is that right now this lobbying is mainly due to generics, and what big companies do is they use pay for delay agreements simply because they have the money. When we have price controls, you cut the amount of money that pharmaceutical companies are able to pay off generics, but then mitigate their impact. Because remember what we tell you from the Senate hearing is that 84% of all drugs that are made through research and development aren't actually new and innovative drugs, but they're simply just remakes. But then, lastly, off prior. Remember what we tell you is that public innovation, it's much better and it's much safer, and we can still have that, even in the affirmative world, at the point where the government gives $1 billion to every single company, and that can even happen for the generic companies. But lastly, we're going to be weighing on probability at the point where reducing reduced prices is a better way to increase in access. And lastly, on urgency, at the point where people aren't getting access right now, we need to solve that right now.
All right, we're going to take turns starting now. We'll start on the neg.
Say again?
We'll start on the neg, and then we'll go to the
Cool.
Okay. At the top of our case, he extends this warrant, he extends this response that says monopolies are able to pay for delayed generics, but that is not our argument. We say that the companies in the status quo are rejecting price control bills, and insofar as that's true, their argument doesn't matter, because this functions as terminal defense on their second contention. Because if these type of pharmaceutical lobbies are putting loopholes in the bills, all of the offense that they are talking about is not going to exist, because the bill is going to be completely useless. Also, they drop the fact that pay for delay can happen in their world. The second response they go for is that 84% of drugs on the current market are Me Too drugs, but they drop an interesting response that says that all these Me Too drugs are big businesses. These small businesses are the ones that have to be innovative, which is why we say from the McKinsey Global Institute that we're on the horizon for a new innovation. The next response he reads is that public research is better than private research. There's two issues to this. First of all, the PMI evidence says that 80 to 90% of all the drugs on the market were discovered by the private sector, which means that that is better than the public sector. But second and more importantly, the public sector is the prerequisite to the private sector. Yes, funding comes from the public sector, but the only way to bring it to the market is through the private sector, which is why we say that the private sector, which is what these these small businesses are much more important. That being said, you can study GINA evidence that says that creating a drug takes a lot of time and effort, and the Abbott evidence says that a 10% decrease in price leads to a 6% decrease in R&D. The Leno evidence says that 2/3 of all drugs on the market come from small businesses. This is really critical because we impact the whole entire world. At best, they say that 100,000 people every single year are going to be saved. We say that the drugs that are sold at a lower price have saved 20 million people worldwide. Go to the affirmative. At the top of their first contention about marketing, they do not respond to two things. The first of which is the Schroeder evidence that says that they're going to shift R&D spending to marketing, which means that the same impacts that they're talking about are going to happen in their world. But second of all, the FDA requires clinical trials to be told to these doctors. If a doctor knows his drug is ineffective, they're not going to prescribe it to their patients. Then, on contention 2 about decreasing costs, there's 2 more responses they don't respond to. First of all, our small business argument links in for 3 reasons. A, it makes it more cost effective, it decreases overall healthcare expenditures, and when you make more small businesses, you make it competitive, which deconstructs a monopoly. The last thing, which is also a impact mitigation on their case, is the PBM response that says they control for 95% of the decrease in prices. At best, they decrease prices like the 5% decrease in prices.
Are you guys ready for round? Are you guys ready for round? Okay. So let's start on all these responses on our second contention about saving money in the long term, right?
And a little late. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So what's the probability of that?
Of what?
Of like innovation in the long term, solving back all these things?
Well, the evidence, like for which one? We give evidence and like studies for each one.
No, yeah, I get that. But what's the probability of that happening? Like you tell me
100%.
that all of these studies are contingent on new drugs actually being
The
produced.
probability is 100% because it's happening now.
Wait,
like it
no,
finds
no.
that every $1 that's spent on medicines means $10 they don't have to spend on surgeries and things
No,
like that.
I get that.
Okay.
But all of those impacts are contingent upon new drugs being produced.
Yeah, so the
McKinsey
new drugs are constantly being produced.
So A, we read the McKinsey evidence says that we're on a horizon of new innovation, and also there are multiple examples. Like if you asked for this earlier, I would have given you multiple examples of new drugs that have been created for like leukemia and hepatitis C.
Probability.
Yeah, I know.
probability
It's
is 100%.
happening right now. The new
Wait,
drugs
you
are
tell us
being
that
created.
research and development is happening, but you don't tell us the impact.
Do you want me to give you drug examples right now? I
No,
can
I'm
do
just
that.
asking for probability. That's all.
That is
100%.
probability. Yeah,
Okay.
it's happening right now. It's
Great.
100%.
Andy,
Cool.
did you say something?
Yeah, so you say that like research and development will like in the long term lead to like societal benefits, right? Like
Yeah.
they save money.
Like
So,
in the
like,
last
if you
20
tell us-
years,
Yeah.
in the last 20 years, 20 million lives have been saved in the developing world, and also 73% of the increase in life expectancy in the developing world is because of American innovation.
Wait. Okay, that's like just like medicine, right? But like that's not like the long term
Pharmaceutical.
impact of like people like getting more access.
Of
to
people
like,
living,
Wait,
people like
20 million
surviving.
people survived, which means they definitely got access to it.
I mean, sure, that's like a separate impact, but like
No, no,
we're trying to
that's
talk about
that is
like
a big
impact. Okay.
You have a question?
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. So you keep going for this like marketing thing. Like, how is it, like, if they have to be clinically accurate and like the advertisements have to be 100% true, how are they like over prescribing
Okay.
wrong things?
So I can give you the example of the opioid crisis that we talked about in
Yeah.
case. The reason as to why the opioid crisis happened is because marketing, like the people who do detailing for pharmaceutical companies went to doctors and said, hey, you should prescribe these opioids to everybody who comes in here with any kind of pain. They're not addictive at all.
That's before
20 years
2015.
later.
Yeah, when
20
was that
years later.
opioid crisis?
No, I agree with you. The opioid crisis has already been an issue.
No, that's
No,
not
no,
the
no,
problem.
that's not the
You asked
issue.
me-
The issue is that in 2015 is when these new guidelines and when the FDA started enforcing the rule about
And the opioid
Okay.
crisis has been like, has
Right,
been a
but
thing
that
since
doesn't
like,
negate the fact that doctors still prescribed opioids for people who did not
Yeah,
necessarily
okay, so
need them.
they prescribed it to them pre-2015 because there was no regulation that says they have to be clinically
So
accurate.
is there now a regulation that
Yes.
says?
Yes,
No, no,
post
no, no,
2015, the FDA
that's
says
not
that
my
everything
question.
has to be
That's
clinically
not my
accurate.
question.
Yeah.
My question is there now a regulation that says that doctors can only prescribe opioids to a person with a certain level of pain?
I'm not sure.
Exactly, there isn't. Because of the, like, our argument is that they were prescribing opioids for issues that didn't need opioids because they were being influenced by pharmaceutical marketing people.
So it has, okay.
That's fine. Okay. So I'm going to be starting on our case, some responses, and then just weighing. Okay. Is everybody ready? Specifically on our second word, second contention. Everybody good? Okay. Starting on our second word of our second contention. contention, this is the easiest place to vote for us. We tell you that pharmaceutical price controls are the only risk of solvency to solve back for the pharmaceutical monopolies that are raising prices right now. Box of Harvard specifically explains that in the status quo, monopolies are using $3.5 billion every single year in pay-to-delay agreements, which limits the access to generic drugs that drive down costs. This is really important because if they are not able to maintain their monopoly power, they're not able to do the lobbying and the marketing that they tell you are such a problem in their case. We're the only risk of solvency for their case as well. But even further, Morton of the University of Oslo specifically explains that when we implemented price controls in Norway, and the evidence proves that we saw a skyrocket in the amount of generic drugs because monopolies no longer had the resources to maintain their control of the market. That's really important because Easton explains that unrestricted growth of the generic drug market has the ability to drive down prices by 50%. That's really important because that is where we gain access to the 125,000 people that are dying every single year because they do not have access to their drugs. They respond to this with a bunch of things that say that research and development and new drugs decrease costs in the long term, but they don't respond to the way in which we outweigh on probability. In fact, Berkerot of Bruder specifically finds that the probability of a drug that even passes phase 1 and makes it even to the FDA is only 10%. The probability of all of their impacts on innovation happening are only 10%, while we guarantee a 50% decrease in drug prices, which is really important because we outweigh on the urgency of the 125,000 people who are dying right now in the status quo. They can't even prove to you 100% probability that they save one person. But then, on their case on lobbying, they tell you that lobbying is going to make it so that only small businesses are affected by price controls, but remember, we are the only ones in today's round that give you any risk of solvency for this lobbying by limiting monopoly power and revenues. But secondarily, on research and development, they tell you that right now, we're like on the brink of the horizon of new research and development. Make them prove to you that they're actually going to materialize into something. But secondarily, we outweigh on prerequisites. Even if you grant them all of their R&D impacts, it is a prerequisite to be able to afford these drugs in the first place because right now, people cannot.
Alright, is everyone ready? I'm starting off on our case.
Cool.
On our case, they have a couple responses. The first thing they send is that in their world they can't afford to lobby, so it's not going to happen. That's not responsive to the argument. The argument is that if there's a price control bill that gets passed, they'll use the money they have right now to lobby for loopholes and exceptions, meaning they're never going to lose the revenue in the first place. That's what we tell you is the reason why the last 24 Senate bills didn't make it, and we tell you that when the Clinton administration tried to do price controls, they couldn't pass it because of all the lobbying. The second thing she tells you is that only 10% of drugs that actually make it onto the market, or like only 10% of drugs actually make it onto the market. That's not responsive insofar as hundreds of drugs make it onto the market every single year. And the IONU evidence that they don't respond to tells you that small businesses are responsible for 2/3 of the new drugs that come onto the market. The last thing she tells you is that she's a prerequisite because affordability means that even if there's innovation, people can't afford it. We tell you that even if that's true in the United States, even if they win their case, it doesn't matter because we decrease the price. We can give drugs to other countries all over the world that do have price regulations and they actually can afford it. That being said, there's a couple things to extend on our case. The first is the idea that if they lobby for loopholes and exemptions, there's not going to be any effect on prices. That's terminal defense on their case that they drop, because if big companies are not affected by price controls, prices are going to remain high. Second, we tell you that you decrease the profitability of small businesses, they drive innovation. That's why we link into our impact of increasing life expectancy by 73% and saving 20 million lives in the last 10 years. That outweighs their case. A, it's more than just the United States, it's the whole world. B, developing countries need medicines way more than the United States because we're a developed country. And C, we link into their case in a couple of ways. Like Jasper tells you. A, because we make drugs more cost effective. We can innovate a drug that people have to take less, even if it costs $1 more, they're saving more overall. Second, we tell you, you decrease overall cost. Every $1 spent on medicines means $10 overall. You spend less on healthcare. And third is eternal defense from pharmaceutical benefit manufacturers. They are the ones that are causing the high prices because they buy drugs from the pharmaceuticals, which is what price controls, but they charge way higher. They are part of the insurance industry. They don't get price controlled, and they affect 95% of the market. They're only affecting the remaining 5%, so they don't really have much.